There's Alice in Wonderland falling down the rabbit hole, and we want to help you prevent you from falling down the research rabbit hole yourself, which is one of the dangers maybe of researching and writing a literature review. So let's start with what is a literature review, because we can say there's sort of two kinds of literature reviews. There's a standalone assignment. So, maybe your professor says, write a literature review for this class. Um, and it's not necessarily connected to a thesis or a dissertation. And then, of course, there's what we think is the real thing, the big time. And that is when you're writing a literature review as a section of a thesis or dissertation. So it's useful to think about the purposes of these different things. And in our opinion, if it's a standalone assignment, there's something a little bit artificial about that, and maybe a little bit difficult about that, because really the purpose of a literature review is to prepare you and your readers for your own research, to set the stage for your own research. If you're writing a standalone literature review, you may have to do some imagination and some of your own, you might have to take some of your own initiative and think about the purpose and the reason and a potential research plan or research goal, which Abbie's going to talk more about. If you're writing the big time, the real thing, the literature review for a thesis, then you should probably have some idea of where you're headed already, and that might make it a little bit easier. But of course, probably you're talking about a bigger project and maybe even a few years of work. And what is the purpose of a literature review? I think one thing that students tend to think the literature review is to show your committee, show your professors that you've done your reading, you've done your homework, you've read all the things that you were supposed to read. And yeah, maybe that's true to some extent. But if you think that's all that it is, if you think that's the only purpose, then you can run into some problems. So it's important to remember the real purpose. And that's to show how the previous research in your field leads to your research. Another way to say that is to show that you know the place of your research in your field, and I would say even in the world. Because remember, when you are, even though you're only writing um, a thesis or a dissertation, right now, if you're working on it, you think, oh, I'm only writing this to get to my to my master's degree or my PhD. But you should remember that people are going to read this, maybe, possibly, hopefully, and you're going to read this later as a text, unconnected to this particular um, goal that you have in your life. And you want to show, defend, and justify in a way what you're doing. And the literature review is a big part of that and a big way to do that. So again, takeaway point, it's not just a bunch of um, summaries, a bunch of um, references piled up on each other just to show that you've done your research. It needs to be something more than that if you want it to have an impact. Now, the danger that you could fall under is the rabbit hole lit review. And so, here's a little story, an imaginary story, but maybe it will resonate with some of you. So maybe something like this has happened to you before. Let's say you start reading some high profile text in your field. It has a quote from Camus in it, the great French writer. Then you decide you need to read everything Camus ever wrote before you can go any further in your research. And then you decide you need to read everything Camus ever read before you can go further. You end up becoming a French existentialist, and your lit review ends up being just a bunch of quotations showing how every writer since Plato has defined the word nothingness. And here's the punchline. Your field is EU security policy. Okay, so you have fallen down the rabbit hole, gone way, way farther than you should have or needed to. And maybe you had an interesting time, but your literature review will be a disaster. Okay, hopefully nobody has gone through such an extreme experience, but I think we've all been there where we find ourselves following this path of research. One thing is connected to another, one thing leads to another. And by the time we realize it, we've run out of time. So how do you avoid that? One way, and this is sort of how we think about it, one way is to make sure you know the difference between the process and the product. So the process of a literature review could, like we said, take many, many years. You might wander, you might follow a lot of different paths, but you need to make sure that you mark that path and that you know sort of where you're going, even if you don't know completely. And most importantly, knowing when to stop. And Abbie is going to, in a moment, take over and tell you about the process. And then I'm going to take back over after a few minutes and tell you more about the product, which is different, right? Because once you've spent days, months, years researching and following a path through the research. But now you actually have to forget that in some ways and say, okay, I'm not going to give a story of my wandering path through the research. Instead, you need to create a new path through the research for the reader, for yourself and for your committee and for your future readers, which will lead them to your research. Right? So I'm going to send it over to Abbie, who's going to take over and tell you about the process, and then I'll be back to talk to you about the product in a moment.
Zoom faux pas. I started talking on mute. I have definitely fallen prey to the unfortunate research literature review hole. I have found myself to become a French existentialist at times, and this was me. But the way out of that actually is to make yourself a kind of research plan. Essentially, you need to outline what is known and what is unknown. And a lot of the struggle in trying to create, before I get into it, trying to create a research plan or an outline, or even knowing when to stop looking for sources, or even writing those sources down in a way where it's not just a whole bunch of summaries of what other people have said about something to satisfy your professor. A lot of that has to do with the the fear and the insecurity it takes to make the leap from reading one person's words, which is rather safe, you're still in the research process, into the writing process, whereby you have to put your own thought and organization and collaboration and, I said organization, but your own personage into that process to some extent. And that can be the scariest leap, or at least it is for me. It's always hardest to start the writing process, so to speak. But where you can do that with a literature review is to start by making a plan. But of course, the plan is a process in and of itself. So to get started with that, I would recommend, and by the way, as I go through my slides, mine are quite a bit more filled with text than Joe's. And this is because I want you to have some kind of source to take away. Maybe if you read the PDF later and you want to go back through what was said, you can read it. But normally don't follow my example and don't put too much text on your slide. So the first thing that I would recommend you do is recognize that actually your research topic, the interest that you have, this cool idea that you have going in your brain, it can be the whole in and of itself, right? It's hard to know where to begin or where to end with this whole. And you have to figure out what about that whole interests you. You have to start to think about the topic, decide what you would like to know more about, even if it's several different things. Start to note those things down, and then gradually you can turn those interests about your topic into a research question or questions, which I'll show you a bit later. Secondarily, I would recommend you stay on your path through the PDFs. And this is just a clever turn of phrase. It can also mean stay on your path through all the books, the guided readings your professors have given you, the syllabi that you have to go through, the reference lists of other scholars that you're looking into when you're doing your research. Try to stay on your path through that kind of madness. And the best way to do this is to decide upon a guiding question. What's going to guide your research? What's going to, help you figure out your path through the stack of nonsense or the stack of PDFs or books? And that guiding question is going to be a research question. You don't essentially want to schlep around all this extra data, all this extra information around, with yourself, with the idea that one day, eventually, you're going to go through all of it after you finish looking for more and more and more. You want to build a manageable pile of data or resources for yourself that you can go through once you have decided to kind of take a break in your research process, or this first step, which I think Joe and I have called wandering through all of the data at this point. And the last one would be to set some reasonable boundaries, because of course you cannot cover every single thing about a topic. If I give you the example of looking at why chocolate chip cookies may be the most popular type of cookies, in Europe or in America, I cannot possibly give you the entire history of cookies, where they came from, all the different types, all of the consumer data from all the backgrounds and so on. It becomes too robust. It becomes way too broad, and it's unmanageable. This is oftentimes the feeling you get as a student when you've collected so much that you feel overwhelmed or almost crushed under a pile of your own research. And yet at the same time, we are addicted to information. We're addicted to gathering more and more sources, and we feel like we're doing a good job as students and as researchers, gathering more and more and more. But actually, you might just be building a mountain under which you're going to crush yourself later. So you have to set some boundaries to let yourself be guided through this process, and not to create a rabbit hole, and not to create a mountain that's going to crush you later, because the boundaries help you stay on a clear path. They're also going to tell your readers what you will cover and what you won't cover. And that's really important, because it adds to your credibility as a researcher, as a student, as an academic, whatever it might be, when you specifically state in your research paper, in your literature review, the exact boundaries, the exact time frame, the exact theme, topic, whatever it might be, you're going to cover, and what you're not going to cover. Because if somebody were looking at your literature review, looking at your thesis, looking at your research paper, their first question might be, but why didn't you look at it from this angle or that angle? You're missing this, key factor, this bit of research. And setting those boundaries early on for yourself in the research process, and later on as it becomes hopefully part of your thesis and your research paper, will let your reader actually know the boundaries according to which you were, abiding while you were looking for your sources and trying to set a research question, and eventually trying to discover a hypothesis and come with some conclusions to that question. Yeah. So if we go back to the very first recommendation, I'm going to give you a little bit of practicality here, because that was all kind of hot air. We could all agree, probably. So the topic, the research topic, the thing you're really interested in writing about, it's actually only the beginning. And this is one of the things that I think Joe would agree, we see more often than not when we look at literature reviews, or even the process of doing research, starting out and writing summaries, is that the topic seems to be the kind of guiding light that pushes you through all these sources, or pushes you through online databases, books, references, and all this. And the topic in and of itself is too broad. This is what's going to create that mountain that's going to crush you later. So with your topic, you have to actually sit back and start the process of critical thinking. You want to look and see what interests you about that topic. What could you say to other people about that topic? What might other people find interesting about that topic? What have people not said about that topic? Or more specifically, or maybe more generally, what do you want, sorry, losing my voice. What do you want to try to accomplish by researching that topic? So you want to start thinking, essentially. Otherwise, like I said, your research process is going to become quite dizzying very quickly with all of the types of sources you're going to try to start to manage with that. The second phase I recommend is to not get stuck in this topic, listing author to author to author. This isn't sufficient per se. You don't want to find essentially a whole bunch of relevant authors and simply note down what they have said and consider this your literature review. This is another common final form I would see. And I think that this would be the one, perhaps you can agree with me or disagree with me even now or at the end of the session, that some of the professors might expect from you when they give you the standalone literature review. They just want to see what all the authors that they've assigned you have said about a certain topic. But that's not necessarily a literature review. That's a literature summary of several sources. So the key difference there is you need to do the review part. And with the review part, you have to start thinking about what it is you want to solve or find out about that topic. Or with these authors, when you compare them, what types of problems start to emerge and what do you actually want to do with those problems? What do you want to think about? What interests you the most? And for phase 3, you're going to take that interest and you're going to try to decide the kind of paths you want to take through the databases and pages of the wilderness to try to help you solve those kinds of questions. It could start out with one question you have, many questions that you have. It doesn't matter at this stage. The important thing is that you're thinking about it. So you want to try to think about some potential solutions or even hypotheses, which could be the answer to your research question, along the way that could actually help you solve what you're trying to find out. Normally, we think about research questions when we're reading things, when we're reading sources, books, chapters, whatever it might be. As we begin to actively read it, active being the key word, we start to think about why the author said this, or why they chose this source, or why this particular thing would be a problem. And wait, how does it interact with this other thing I also know about? And this can start to help you form the research question. But when you form the question, you probably are going to start to have in mind some kind of hypothesis. You're going to think, wait, maybe I think that actually this could be the answer to my question. It's not something that always comes immediately when you start the process, but as you begin to read more and more, when you gather sources, you're going to notice that your thinking tends to lean one way or the other as you kind of explore these different paths related to your topic or your research question. You're going to start thinking, I think that this is actually the answer, and I'm going to explore this path to see what other scholars have to say about that. But again, I want to emphasize that it is a process. It's not these 3 phases, they don't happen instantaneously the second that you pick up a journal article or a textbook and you've done 3 readings. It's not something that's going to come to you right away. It's going to come to you as a process. The more that you read, the more that you look and search, using keywords hopefully related to your research question or topic, the more that you read and search, the more it's going to become clear to you what types of questions and then hypotheses or potential answers to those questions might actually emerge. Your curiosities, in other words, are going to be beginning to peak. And this is the most important thing, as we said, you need to start thinking. This is the beginning of any literature review. This is the difference between writing those summaries and writing a review of the literature, is putting, shoot.
Can I jump in, Abbie? Because I think also I'm glad that you mentioned the creating a hypothesis, or another way is creating a guiding question or a research question. I actually, I think I have some students here. As you know, I make my students actually write it down, put it into words. I think that's really helpful too, because even though, of course, it's going to change. And so, if you're only a week into the research versus a year into the research, hopefully your guiding question or your research question or your hypothesis, well, definitely it will change. But actually writing it down, having it like in a little, section in your notebook and changing it and revising it, not only does that help you think of keywords, think of how you will express it, but it also, I think, gives you a nice way to sort of watch your own progress and reflect on your own progress. So not only, as you said, Abbie, thinking about it, but actually writing
you're
it
gonna
down,
write it
even
down.
though,
It's farther along in my
yeah,
explanation.
even though it's, right.
So after you think about that, and of course write it down in a notebook or write it down in a Word document or even a Google Doc, start scribbling some things. This is never a bad practice as a student or as an academic. We should all note down our thoughts. We want to try to outline or determine a kind of scope. And a scope is just a big, it's not a big, it's a short fancy word to say boundaries. Essentially, as I mentioned, you have to limit the research you're going to do in order to give yourself some sanity and some, guiding paths where you're going to pursue the research, as well as inform your readers what you're not going to discuss, perhaps, what you are going to focus on. So excuse me, the scope is not necessarily, the outline of the scope is not an outline of your paper, which will come later when you try to organize it. And it's not an outline of the sources you found. It's not that big list of bibliography. It's actually you setting the boundaries of your research question itself. And the best way to determine the scope of your literature, the best way to find those boundaries is to actually pull your research question or questions apart. Pull those thoughts that you have apart as you're going through the research process. And of course, we have to mention the standalone literature review because many of you have to do that for your school assignments. And my advice, and I think Joe could agree on this, is always imagine that your standalone literature review is eventually one day or could become part of a thesis or a research paper itself. Because as Joe mentioned, this is the purpose behind the review part of the literature review and not just a literature summary itself. Also, be careful before we go into the next step. Don't think of these boundaries as final or in stone or unchangeable or unmovable, because sometimes you have to adjust them. So for example, just a couple of tips, not to go too much into detail. If you're finding too many sources in your research process, this is going to be a good hint that you need to actually narrow your scope of these paths, of these different interests you have, or even potentially your research question if you have too many paths that begin to emerge. And conversely, if you have too few sources, too few paths, this would be a good hint that you actually need to broaden it a little bit. But specificity is going to be the key here when you start to do your research process. And I'll show you in my example in just a moment. So the last thing I'll say about boundaries is, of course, with all this in mind, you have to be realistic, whether you're a bachelor's student, a master's, doctoral student, or even a postgraduate or working academic. You've got a limited amount of time. We all have limited amounts of time. So you have to be realistic with yourself, your abilities to do the research effectively, read your sources effectively, and set your goals for your boundaries accordingly. Don't set such a broad research task, for example, for a small bachelor's thesis of 30 pages. So it all has to be relative. And this is where your advisor can certainly help you if you are working on a thesis with your literature review. So how would you go about pulling your research questions apart? And I'm not just going to look at the research question itself. I'm also going to back up a little bit and give you some questions for the topic. And I'm going to go through this quickly, not to take too much time away from Joe. But think about it kind of like a Matryoshka doll, right? Inside it, you have several little other tiny dolls, and you can split it apart thusly. So with your topic, if you want to go about trying to create a research question, you should start asking yourself these types of questions. What interests me? What problem am I looking at? What do I know? What do I not know yet? What could I try to find out? Why is it relevant now? And if I research this, will it be relevant for the field later? Have other people already done this? Is it popular among scholars? If it's not anymore, was it in the past? And so on. When did the popularity seem to stop? After you determine some of the answers to these questions, you can start to ask yourself the golden formula for creating the research question, which is where you start to insert what about X, or why did X do, or how did X happen, or which one of, when did, who did, or said, etc. So for just a really basic, kind of silly example, I stuck with cookies because I didn't want to overwhelm you a little bit here. But I created a little research question at the top, and everything you see in italics, this is my effort to actually show you how to narrow the scope of your research question, to be specific at certain times when it could actually help you. So were Chips Ahoy chocolate chip chewy cookies favorite, the most beloved store-bought cookies in the United States in the late 1990s or not? Yeah. So the paths we might want to take for that would be, first, which brand of cookies were the most popular in these 3 decades for comparison? How does the texture and sweetness and everything about a cookie actually affect the preference? Maybe thirdly, how does the availability with the retailers, places that sell it, affect the purchasing habits? 4, is it possible to map the locations of the stores and the purchasing and the quantities? And then 5, how does the price affect it? And there could be many more questions as you pull that apart. So all of this would help you to shape all of those paths that kind of split out that we're talking about, to help you start on this process of actually trying to go about forming a hypothesis to your research question that you would already have here, right? You can think of more and more paths, but the trick is not to think of too many, because if you think of too many, of course, then you've just fallen down the rabbit hole yet again, and the scope of your research is too broad. So start off with just a few that you can think of, set that in your outline, the scope of your research outline, and start by researching those specific questions that come about. Look for research in these areas first, these first 5, before you move on through 6 through 10. This will help you keep it in a manageable state. And to stay on the path, of course, I wanted to emphasize that when we think about literature review as a process, we have to also think that many things go into it. So just briefly, active, not passive, active reading, note-taking, constant note-taking, critical thinking, not just, oh, this is cool, but actually, philosophically diving into the topic of cookies. Analyzing what's being said by the author. Why did the author say that? Engaging what's being said. Put your own thoughts in with the author, and then revising, which goes a little bit into my point here about organizing and sometimes reorganizing the outline of your research. So you want to kind of make an outline of your path set by your scope. You've pulled it apart. You have all the directions you want to take. And if you feel lost, ask yourself if those articles that you found, all the research that you've compiled, these stacks, does it directly relate to one of these first 5 paths? If not, shelve it, put it aside. You can come back to it later. Secondly, organize the outline occasionally and over and over. It doesn't have to be every single day, which is why I said occasionally, but you want to come back to it and make sure that it stays on track in some form of organized sequential thinking, however you order it, so that you can keep it as a manageable process within your mind. Because a lot of this is mental, right? Stress affects us so much when we're trying to do research and trying to write papers. So think about how the sources can fit together when you think about organizing, and how that research can actually form a dialogue with what you're thinking at the moment. This will help you to pick the best paths forward to actually research first. And then lastly, orientate, if you're British, or orient yourself before you wander further through more research. So again, narrow or broaden the scope of your research question if you find out that you're getting too many or too few returns on those searches for research. So you've got some sources, but when do you stop? The tricky answer is you don't. Like I mentioned, it's a process. But a good guide for this is that you should check the sources of new literature until your paper is submitted. But be kind to yourself, give yourself breaks to kind of stop and think about the sources that you've already summarized, analyzed, thought about first. Don't just keep it as a constant searching process, right? Secondly, when does the writing start? Well, the whole here to avoid falling into is that you should not stop researching, quote unquote, and then start writing your final paper. You're actually going to be doing it at the same time, which sounds tremendously overwhelming. But that's why I emphasize picking a few of these paths first when you pull apart your research question, so that you can keep it in a manageable state. You're going to kind of write some summaries as you go along, and then you're going to incorporate that into your paper, see how long it is, see what gaps are missing, and this might give you some further paths forward after the fact. And then lastly, when will my literature review be done? Well, it's done when you submit it to your professor, right? But it's also done when you submit it as a research paper or a thesis. If you work in the field, it's never done. That's, the terrifying fact. But a good rule of thumb is that you should be checking it every once in a while, not, pedantically every single day, but every once in a while to make sure that no new sources have emerged that you've missed in your writing process as you were maybe polishing it or something like that. For example, if you expand your research question, if you decide to go in an opposite way, remember, so too does your research or literature review also need to expand or go in another way. So here are some tips that I have for you when to know when to stop wandering through the maze. And here, are you coming across the same information more than once? Have you already found some relevant information in different types of sources? If you added a new angle, subtopic, or basically a path, as we're saying now, would it actually complicate your argument or strengthen it? I think this is the most important one I would give you. Finally, are you collecting information that's off topic? We've already set the paths to help you avoid that. Are you running out of time? Remember, be realistic according to when you need to turn it in. And lastly, if you have enough information to cover the main points, perhaps this is a good time to consider your paper as a draft or finalized product that you could revise to see if there's holes missing if you need to do further research. If you have enough information, go ahead and consider it done for the moment and then draft your paper, your literature review, or your thesis, right? So I'm going to talk about annotated bibliographies, but maybe briefly. How am I doing on time, Joe? How much more you want to give me for this?
Well, I think you have this. You're going to talk about annotated bibliographies and then me. Is that it?
Yeah.
Is that the plan?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Sounds
All
good.
right. I'll try to be as brief about this as possible because, as usual, we're going to give you some helpful sources that you can take away after this gab and actually, read them and use them for yourself, so I don't have to go into too much detail. But essentially, an annotated bibliography is the process of taking notes and thinking about the notes that you take related to the sources that you look up. That was a long sentence. That's why we call it this fancy term. But as you gather these sources and you read them and you decide they're relevant for you, you've skimmed the abstract, sounds good. You've skimmed the first paragraph, the introduction, you've skimmed the conclusion, looks like it's going to be good. Maybe you're going to keep that one and decide to go through it for your final paper or literature review. Sounds on topic. You're going to want to read that source effectively. And by effectively, I mean ideally once, and I mean not passively. You don't want to have to go back and read it again to remember the details. So everybody goes about making an annotated bibliography a little bit differently. I'm sure Joe has his own process. I'm sure many of you have your own processes when you go about doing this. Mine is a little bit over the top, but it helps me a lot, and I'll tell you why. The first thing is that I make sure that I cite my source at the beginning of a document. I open a fresh document. I don't fiddle around with the most current software for mind mapping and all of that. If it's useful to you, we'll give you sources. I encourage you to do it, but I just do it in a Word document. I put the source so I don't have to do it later. We all know the burden or the saddest thing about finishing a paper or doing something like that is having to go back and find all your sources after. When you're already done, it's torture. Don't do it to yourself. So put it at the top of your annotated bibliography, do it right once the first time, and you don't have to worry about it later. Then you're going to want to gather something called the authority of the source, which is really important for example, maybe the Faculty of Social Studies, or looking at journalism, or looking at articles published by, I would say, non-academic authorities, or you're trying to discover the authority that an individual has to actually write on that topic. That way, your argument, when you use their data to support or contest your point of view, you want to make sure that they have the credibility to speak on the source, that it's not just, forgive me, but Joe Blow or Jane Doe from the internet writing their opinion about whatever. You can actually use it in your research paper and your literature review when you want to introduce the article for the first time that you're talking about. So I can say, Dr. So-Won Park of the English department for the University of Oxford in England wrote this article on blah, 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 blah. Yeah, and I can use it as her introduction. Nobody's going to doubt me. They respect the university. They're going to be fairly interested in what she has to say. Yeah, so it's part of choosing the best sources to support your argument or to support your research. Then what I would advise you to do is write a summary of the source. A summary, as I tell my students, is not 2 lines. It's not. If you write a summary of 2 lines, you're going to go back and read that article again before you write your paper. And it's going to be a long, painful process. A summary is very detailed. And mine actually include in-text citation so that I don't have to go back and do it later, remember the page number. I directly put it into my final paper. You can do the same thing with your literature review. Write the summary in your own voice. Make sure that the reader of your literature review, professor or otherwise, can understand what is your voice versus the author's voice. So, for example, what is my voice versus Dr. Park's voice in this? It should be a dialogue, not just a regurgitation of everything Dr. Park said in her academic article on Virginia Woolf. And then lastly, what I like to do is pull out key quotations. How to decide when to quote or when to paraphrase or when to put it into your own your own thoughts and words. This is a case-by-case basis, but my general rule is when I see the quotation written in the best way possible, my words couldn't necessarily add to or subtract from the meaning, and I want to keep the author's voice on this topic. Then I take that quotation, I consider adding it into my paper, and I write myself a brief note of response in my voice about what I thought about that quotation. Why did I choose it? Later, when I go actually to write my thesis or longer research paper, I can use these quotations, this summary, and I can remember exactly what the article was about, exactly which quotations I wanted to use, and exactly who wrote it. That means I don't have to go back to the article a second time. So it's a little bit of a more complicated and involved process, but this is how I do it. You can also tell us, for example, if you have ever written down some notes about the sources that you're reading, how you do it. But I think the key difference between a standalone literature review, or basically summary for your professor, and one that goes into a research paper or a thesis is that you have to add your own voice into this summary somehow. You have to be able to show that you've critically thought about it and you can explain it and that it actually relates to your research question. It's not just a list of facts. Okay? I think that that's what I wanted to say about my bit. If I can turn it back over to you, Joe, for the product side of the process.
Yep, that's a good segue. Thanks, Abbie, because that's where I would start. So if we are, okay, can you see my screen again, hopefully? Oh, I need to get to where we are. By the way, I forgot to say, I'm gonna try to move quickly through my part. I'm gonna talk about how to actually write the paper once you've done all the preparation that Abbie talked about, and then we'll have time for a discussion. So stick around. Um, yeah. So as I said before, you've gone through this long, complicated process. Hopefully, not too painful. You've got your annotated bibliographies with all your different sources. You've got references, the notes that you've taken. You've got a research question. Hopefully at this point you've got some specific idea of where you're going. Now you need to write your paper. The mistake that many people make at this point is simply to, you can call it a chronicle of research. And I've seen this many times where students will just say, essentially, first I looked at this source, here's a summary. Then the next source that I found was this, here's a summary of that, summary, summary, summary. That's not the way to write the literature review, but I think that's the mistake that a lot of people follow. Um, if you do that way, if you basically do the chronicle of your own journey, it's going to be confusing, winding around, and essentially pretty useless for a reader. And that's who you need to think about at this point. Who's actually going to read this, and what are they going to get from it? So you don't do to your reader what this person did, or this guy is just needing the main ideas, but he has to look through miles and miles of paper to do it. Here's what can happen if you go down this rabbit hole of the pile of summaries. And I show this. I've shown this to my students in my writing class. Well, I'm just going to read it, and you can tell me later what you think of it. But empathy is defined as the ability to share and understand the emotional states of others, Eisenberg and Miller, blah, 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 It is an interpersonal phenomenon based on the interaction between the person who's empathizing and the person whose affective state is being shared or inferred, blah, 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 blah. This process involves the detection and perception of multimodal social cues that are dynamic and rapidly changing, blah, blah, blah. It is a multifaceted and complex construct, including affect sharing, mentalizing, self-other distinction, sympathy and compassion, and pro-social behavior. And we have more citations. What's the problem here? We have a sort of, we can call it a train wreck of, quote, in this case, quotations, paraphrases, something in between. We have a visual and metaphorical train wreck of citations. A lot of them are very similar citations. And we have something that is pretty unreadable. It may, if you look at it very quickly, it may look sort of academic with all those citations. But if you actually want to read it, which some people will hopefully try to do with your essay, it's not going to be much fun. And the main problem is that we get no, as Abbie earlier said, there's no review element to this. It's all just copy and pasting essentially. And the author's voice is not there. So how do we fix this problem? I'm going to break it down in sort of three ways. Creating a path. Obviously, your point, your goal when you're writing your literature review is to create a path for the reader. In other words, recreate the path, right? You followed your own path, but you have to forget that. Now you're creating a path for the reader. And there's ways you can do that through the whole review, through each paragraph, and through each sentence. So I'm just going to try and quickly show you those. So as far as creating a path through the whole literature review, the key is choosing some kind of organizing principle. Now, the principle that a lot of people by default choose is chronological. The first person who ever talked about EU security policy was Smith in 1950 or something like this. And then you go through the whole thing. Now that might be a good idea, but there are other ways to do it. So keep that in mind. And I'm just showing you three here, but there's many other ways to do it. The key is that you choose an organizing principle that emphasizes the impact of your study. So the chronological organization to your literature review might make sense if your study, if what you want to do is synthesize a lot of different ideas from different time periods, put them all together and create something from that synthesis. Then a chronological organization makes sense. But you could do it thematically. So, you could say several different authors have focused on this way of looking at chocolate chip cookie, the chocolate chips in the chocolate chip cookie. Other people have focused on the cookie dough. Yet still other people have focused on something else. However, I'm going to talk about taking the cookie dough and putting it in ice cream, which is delicious. So you're well, maybe even getting into methodological there. But the point is you're emphasizing the different approach that you are taking, or the different viewpoint you're taking to the idea of cookies. So a chronological approach there wouldn't be the best. Maybe a thematic one would be, or methodological. So if you're coming up with some new innovative method, maybe you can group together your resources, your references in a sort of methodological way, right? Smith in 1950, Johnson in the 1970s, and Starek in the 1990s did it this way. Yet other people did it another way, but I'm going to do it this way. So the main point is you don't have to do it chronological. Sometimes that's not the best choice. Then getting a little bit more language focused, creating a path through the paragraph. And really, I think, so paragraphs are tricky to know, how, and this is what students and writers always struggle with. How do I create a paragraph? This is sort of a generic structure that you can use that might be useful for a literature review. and you can see it different ways. I'm calling it claim, evidence, takeaway, but you can also see it as a little sandwich. Your voice at the beginning of the paragraph, your voice at the end of the paragraph, in the middle, the voices of the other people who you are referencing and referring to. I'm not going to read this out loud, but I think you don't have to. I don't have to. You can take a quick look at it actually and see. Well, I'm going to read the first sentence. So, however, other studies have shown that even gender-neutral antecedents are more likely to produce masculine images than feminine ones. This is the author giving the sort of overall summary. Actually, there's a reference there, but it's a sort of summary or synthesis of various different sources. Then we have Hamilton. We have a reference to a particular study. And this is just an example, but it could, the paragraph could maybe be a little bit longer, and you could have Hamilton, Jones, Smith, and a few different references which support that first sentence, right? Other studies have shown this. So you're going to gather together all the studies that have shown that, put them into this one paragraph, and give the synthesis or the summary at the top. And then it's important, I think, to come back to some kind of summary, synthesis, or takeaway point. Okay, in this case, the author is starting with thus. Another way of seeing that is an interpretation of all the different literature that you've mentioned. The point is, again, there needs to be some sort of takeaway point, some interpretation, some review to your literature review. And these are the points in the paragraph where you can do that, especially at the beginning and at the end. And in the middle, sort of give the various more specific references. So it's one paragraph model that could help you, again, create that path for the reader. And finally, I just want to leave you with some thoughts about sentences. And I think in a literature review, well, if you're my student, you have heard this before from me many times, but action verbs are your friends. And the idea behind that is you need to remember that, or at least I see it this way, that research is people doing and thinking things. Other human beings have written and thought and done research, and you are also a human being, and you're thinking and doing these things. And if you can reflect that view of research in the sentence, in the language, then you're creating clearer sentences. You're clearly showing the difference, let's say, between other people's ideas and your ideas. So, just to show you what this can mean, starting, even something as simple as starting the sentence with the attribution. Who said this? So Hamilton, and you can stick the citation there on the end. Hamilton, 1988, asked students to complete sentences, blah, blah, blah. The students were asked to describe any image. There we're using the passive voice, but the concept is still the same. We have a clear subject, somebody doing something. What are they doing, right? And that's at the beginning of the sentence. Hamilton found that people imagined. So you're leading the reader clearly through a set of actions, a set of research actions, and you're emphasizing that in the structure of the sentence by starting with the researcher or the writer, the author of your source, a verb, a strong verb there, and we're gonna post the later on the I guess the YouTube page and on our homepage. We're gonna post the PDF, I guess, is how we do it, and usually we give some links for you. So I've got some links to some great vocabulary you can use, some great verbs to boost up your verb game, and so we'll throw that in the resource that we leave for you guys. So yeah, I think that's what I wanted to say. So again, the takeaway is following that wandering path through your research, but leaving notes, leaving good notes, coming up with a research question, a clear research goal. And then when you sit down to write, of course, you're doing some writing the whole time, as Abbie said, but when you actually go to put your text together, forgetting that sort of wandering path, forgetting the sort of pile of summaries that you have, and really shaping and organizing the text so that it creates a path through the research to your study, to your research and what's important. And you can do that in the overall organization and also in the structure of the paragraphs and structure of the sentences. Okay, well, like I said, we're going to open it up and we'd like to hear from you guys. What are your experiences and what are your questions and what are your responses to what we said? Don't forget to join us on our Facebook page, on our YouTube page, and I'll send you the links in a moment to those. And the last thing I want to emphasize before I turn it over is, we're here for you. We are the Maastricht University Writing Lab, and you can make an appointment anytime. And I'll send the links to or Abbie will send the links to our homepage where you can make an appointment with us. If you're working on a literature review or anything else, make an appointment. We'll Zoom with you, or hopefully in the near future, we'll sit down with you, read a bit of your paper. We won't proofread or edit for you, but we can show you some things that you're doing, talk about your paper with you, answer your questions, and give you some advice and give you some resources. That's what we're here for. So that's it. So yeah. Those of you who are writing a literature review as we speak, what are your concerns? What are your questions? What are you thinking about?
If I can comment a bit, or just say my opinion. I thought I'm going to stay for 5 minutes and I'm still here. So that's a good comment as well. But
we hooked you.
Yeah, definitely. I just wanted to kind of say that there were definitely a lot of excellent points, but two that stayed the most with me because I kind of did, I think during my work on literature review or my thesis, I think I've done that wrong, and now I know how to do it, even though it's too late. But
that's how many of us find out. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the way it goes.
I really loved the text about the fact that you cannot just stop reading and start writing, or like stop the research and start writing, because that was my biggest problem. I was trying to read, then put together some notes and then start writing, and I kind of waited too long for start writing, and then I forgot a lot of the notes, and the notes got kind of mixed up, and it was very hard to find my point. And the worst thing was that I found out that I actually had more and more questions when I reread the notes, and then I didn't kind of know where I found it and where to find, and then I had to find more literature, but I already had a lot, and it was a complete disaster. So I think that's a really good point to just write along the way. And the second one was, what was it? I forgot. I had one more, but I forgot. I'll leave the space for somebody else to comment. But yeah, but thanks a lot for all the suggestions.
Sure, thank you. And it looks like Abbie has wonderfully put our links there to the Writing Lab, to our YouTube channel, and to our Facebook channel. So join us in those places. As we said, we're going to post this. So if you missed something and you want to listen again, it'll be there. And then we're going to post some links to resources, further resources for writing a literature review, more tips and stuff, and vocabulary as well. But yeah, share your stories. Who's writing a literature review now, and what are you struggling with, or what's on your mind?
I'm not writing a literature review, but I have a comment, if I may. Hi.
Hi.
I was sort of wanted to go back on what Abbie said about taking notes, and I always sort of struggled with just copying a lot of quotes from articles that I've been reading, and then it's just this long text full of things that I don't know what are actually about when I look at it. And what really helped me and what I've been trying to use recently is the Kernel Method, which is, yeah, I don't know if you can like share screen and Google it, but it's just like the division of the page, and you can also do it on your computer, where it gives you space for the notes, but also like for your commentary on the notes, and then for a summary at the end, which I find incredibly useful, that you can actually just write down like, yeah, okay, so this is what this paragraph is about, or in just 2 words, like, you know, so this is this paragraph and this is this quote. And then actually summarize it at the end, which makes you reread your notes and sort of think about them a bit. So that would sort of be my tip to check
You
that
said
out.
oh, there we go.
Yeah. And you can set it up
Yeah, I
easily,
haven't heard
like
of that.
in Word or something.
Yeah, I have a bunch of
Nice.
sources actually for you in terms of how to take notes while you're simultaneously researching. And you can compare and kind of shop around which online source works best for you, because this is an excellent one, for example. And there are others that actually allow you to like highlight certain parts of your text and add comments that will not appear if you decide to actually export it and send it somewhere else later. You can hide the comments just in case you are one of those people that talk to yourself while you're researching. Or you can include links to other sources, for example, and you can even diagram them in a way. So this is a good one, but I also have more for you. So be sure to look on our Facebook. I'll make a whole page of them that could possibly help you.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks. And
Thanks,
thank you
Lincoln.
for the lecture and for the overview. It was really useful.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Lincoln. Yeah, any other, and that's what we hope for too. Of course, you know, we always are learning new things. So anybody else have some good tips? What worked for them if you managed to survive your literature review? And you can share your wisdom with others.
Or maybe if I could, have you ever received an assignment for a literature review that you thought was really confusing and you didn't know where to start? Let's say your professor said, you know, review all of these sources from the course and find me the most important bits in this literature. Have you ever had that problem? I have.
I was going to say, it sounds like this is leading to a story.
No, not a story. It's just more like the way that we perceive the standalone literature review. I wanted to give enough space to that because it's a confusing beast, kind of. And yeah, there's also space to ask questions about how to do that, but also meet the expectations of your professor as well, which we have to do while also thinking about how to write a research review effectively so that we could use it in the future. So if you want to tell us about your horror stories and potential solutions, it could also help with that.
If I may ask, I got a little problem. I'm writing a literature review, and there was it's quite a common topic, I would say. Like, it's a behavioral economics, and like a lot of people were talking about it and writing. And there was a man who characterized some things, or like, I don't know how to say it. And then there was a girl who basically summarized it in her paper. And I found both, and I'm not sure who should I cite from. Like, I think the original, but then I'm kind of in a dilemma that somebody would consider it like that I stole it from that girl, because it's basically the same thing. So I'm not sure what to do in that kind of situation. If you could help me, I would be really grateful.
I had the same question before. What I would say is read both the summary from the girl and the original source, because it all depends on the original source you have to read. How long is it? How complicated is it? Is it in another language? All of these types of questions that can, potentially make the original source very difficult to understand. So I would read both, if for nothing else other than to know how it was summarized by other students as an example or a model. But then I think, Joe, you can interrupt me. I would go back to that original source, read it after you read her summary, see if you can use her summary to give you some context, particularly if it's difficult, and then make your own summary. Think about what's written there and then try to say what is written there in your voice. Because the problem with that, I mean, it is and it isn't plagiarism to some extent. It depends on how you use it. But the problem with that is if you use her summary, you're not really thinking about the original source at all. You're just kind of summarizing the summary of the source, and it becomes this game of telephone over time. You know that game where one person says something and by the end it ends up crazy. So I don't know. Joe, go ahead.
Yeah, I think if the question is simply, you have access to both sources. Is that right? That you can read and understand both sources, the original and the summary?
Yes.
Yeah.
Basically, they are all the same.
Yeah.
Like,
so in that
the original is a bit complicated, and the summary is like easier to read, but they are basically talking about the same.
Mm-hmm.
And I would do it pretty much the same way as the girl, let's call it that way, did. And I'm afraid that somebody would exactly call it plagiarism or something. I'm
plagiarism.
Sorry for my language.
Don't have to be sorry.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it becomes plagiarism if you copy her summary word for word, structure for structure, sentence for sentence. But you can definitely use her summary as a model. I can give you actually a concrete example of something similar. It's not a girl summary per se, but I was trying to read a really difficult text by a French post-structuralist fellow, to go back to your joke, Joe, by the name of Lacan. And Lacan is ridiculously difficult to understand. So I also found that there's another philosopher named Slavoj Žižek who basically tells us how to read Lacan. So then I decided to read that one first and go back to the original and use it to give me the context to understand Lacan. And there are some things that I disagree on, but there are some things that I would say exactly the same. So I think the important thing there to distinguish, or to make sure it's not plagiarism, which is what you're afraid about, is to just read it as a model, then read the original source, and then put it into your own words. How do you understand it? How do you think about it? If some things happen to coincide or overlap, that, obviously sometimes happens when you make summaries of things, because people deduce the same points of information, but I don't know, just don't copy it. that's the
You can't.
thing.
Yeah, you can't copy or even use a similar sentence structure as the author who summarized it. If so, this could be, one solution might be to quote the original. If you can, maybe somehow you can work it so that you can use a quotation, and in that case, you should definitely use the quotation from the original, right? Don't quote the summary of, definitely don't quote the summary of the original, because then I think you might be accused of not actually finding the original source, which we usually value, right? In original research, you want to be able to find the original source. But it depends on what your goal is. So if it's simply the information that you need, then yeah, maybe you can either quote the original or summarize it in a way that is not the way the other author summarized it. But it could be that what you are interested in maybe is how the second author used the first authors, and you can describe it that way. Like somebody, whatever her name is, the woman who's the summarizer, she gives this interpretation of the original source, and maybe you can get away with it that way. It's a tricky situation. There's no one right answer. But if it's purely, I would say, if it's purely the information, and you find a quotation or the information in a secondary source, and you have access to the original source, go use the original source. But if it's more you're tracking the different interpretations of it, then maybe pay attention to how that secondary source is using the first source, and maybe you can even still use, you might be able to use both sources, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it makes, but it sounds a little bit complicated. But yeah, thank you very much. Thank you.
I guess try to see the positive, which is what Abbie said, like you have someone's summary, someone's interpretation of it. So that's yet another way of viewing it and another way of interpreting it. But yeah, it does make it annoying if all you want to do is purely paraphrase or summarize that information. Somebody already did that. So you're going to have to find new words and new ways to do it.
Think of it like a guide. You could also look at the summary. If it's relatively short, look at her summary and then try to find the places in the text and think about how you would summarize it differently. If you're really concerned about the plagiarism, but you want to keep the kind of same main points. Which, by the way, actually, Joe, your example of the like mishmash of quotations when you were showing us how this is not necessarily the best type of literature review. This is actually another form of plagiarism. It's called amalgamation, where you're missing your own voice in the text itself. And this would be kind of also a key difference between a summary and a literature review, which should have your own voice in it as well. So plagiarism is tricky.
I suppose it is there. Okay, in that paragraph I showed, I think maybe there was plagiarism because there was some of the original sources not in quotation marks. But I would not call it plagiarism if you just had a string of quotation marks. The problem isn't plagiarism in that case. The problem is that there's no review. There's none of your voice. I mean, if it was all just a string of quotation marks, then we can either call it dropped quotations or even if you have just somebody says this, it's not technically plagiarism if it's in quotation marks, but it's just useless as a literature review, is how I would interpret it.
Can I maybe have a related question? There are sometimes research review articles that summarize like what was the research up till that point. How would you use that kind of articles? Because if everyone always goes to the main source, the article that everyone uses never gets quoted.
If you always go to the main source, the article that everybody used never gets quoted.
I mean the review article.
And do you ever actually go to the sources of the article that you're reading for the review?
Yeah.
Go there and quote that. That's what I would do. And then the previous literature reviews, you can also offer some advice, Joe, as well. But I'm a skeptic and I don't really trust these. I view them as like a diving board of jumping off into something, but I always want to find or do my own process of what are the holes that the other person missed. And this is just about my own desire for credibility as an academic. I don't want to rely on somebody else to do my work, but it can be really helpful to give you, like a brief overview of what's already been said, for example.
That's why it's helpful again to divide process from product, because these sources, these research sources that may not be very useful or sophisticated or proper for your final paper are extremely useful in the process as you are taking notes and leading you to other things. That's why I like Wikipedia, right? You know, you hear when you're in, you know, probably high school or grade school, you cannot use research using Wikipedia. That's such bad advice. Of course you can. You can look at Wikipedia to help you get more links to other resources to find out more. And Wikipedia sometimes is a great place to start research. But if you're writing your master's thesis or your doctoral dissertation, yeah, you shouldn't be quoting Wikipedia, right? But early on in the process, it can help you a lot. So I think it's similar to what you're talking about, maybe Valentina, like these summaries of other sources or these other literature reviews are great resources for you, but you should always probably try to find the original. Unless, and here's where I want to connect this back, because if your literature review is like, if you think of it as leading towards your research and you think of it as actually a review and you're writing it and you're including not your opinions, but your interpretations and your organization of this previous research, then a researcher after you actually could find that extremely valuable, right? Because they're getting this particular way of organizing it, this particular way of framing and looking at the research. So, you know, there are many of you might end up doing research on research and research on the ways that other people have talked about it. I mean, in my field, and I guess Abbie, we're from a similar field, like literature. If you're studying literature, often you are studying the interpretations that other people have made of original sources, right? So, and those are very valuable, right? Or the theorizing or the framing that other people are doing. So you can learn a lot from those. And if that is the scope of your research, to find out about the ways that people have talked about it, then you could quote or summarize or paraphrase those. But if back to the question that the other gentleman had, if it's purely the information you need, then I think it's clear you need to go back to the or the wording, right? Then you need to go back to the original, trace it back to the original, and quote it from there.
I found my rather crazy or obscure list of potential plagiaristic actions, by the way, and I think that they're based on the software, that when you turn in something and they use the protocols, this is what they're looking for. And the one that I had mentioned, these are like the 10 types ordered from most severe, which sounds very punitive. It's not necessarily the intentional, but down here you get into something called the aggregator, which includes some proper citation. Yours, I think it didn't in every single sentence, but it contains almost no original work. And I think that that's the problem that we were getting at.
Fair enough. Okay, so yeah, it's an interpretation of plagiarism. Yeah, I mean, I agree. Like
software
if it's not plagiarism, then it's pointless. So either way, and it's not a literature review, right? If you're just doing the aggregator.
It's a summary of not even
or
words.
just copying and pasting.
Yeah, it's not even your words. Yeah.
Okay, anybody else dealing with some literature review issues? Want to share your experience?
I do have one.
Hannah, you're still here.
Yeah, I know. I got into it really, and I'm dealing with it still. So I'm really interested in all the stories and the ideas. I'm sorry, but I have like a brief story of mine as well, and it goes back to one of the points I wanted to mention as well, and that's the summary of the kind of the author, or like this resource of the resource, because that was a great point. I've never done it, and now I wanted to do like a better text, or I was writing the thesis and everything, and I was looking for the info about the authors, and it was very helpful because sometimes you don't even know how to cite the person anymore or how to put there again their name. And it's nice to have this extra information. And I actually found out that throughout the paper, I had some quotations or some citations, and I had one paper that somewhere was quoted. It was, I think, 2 or 3 authors, and sometimes it was quoted by the one of the person had 2 last names, and one time it was cited by the first one and sometimes the second one, and it was the same paper, and I thought it's not. And it kind of then I found out the information about the whole names and about the authors, and I corrected it. So it's really good idea to find more info. And I found out then during the process of learning from my finals, I remember way more when I find out something about the author. I remember, like, and I can actually use it during the exam. Like, okay, this author that is from this university or deals with this topics, they say this and this. So it's a great resource for the work or for the literature review, but also onwards.
It's that kind of like they say versus I say formulation, but also when you do these investigations into who's actually writing this article, you can look at what else they've written, and sometimes it can lead you to some other sources without having to go blindly through the databases and so on, and you can look at their reference list. So it's almost like they've done the work for you in a way, where you can learn from the smartest minds. I find it really helpful to do that kind of exercise. And then I think at the end of the annotations, I do this type of note to myself or ranking system, how effective this source was to me. That way, when I've done all my research, let's say that I have 30, 40 annotated bibliographies, I don't want to go back and read the articles. I'm going to try to put all my summaries and my own thoughts together. I look at the end and I think, this one was a little bit less useful than this other one. So I actually kind of rank them. I think this is what you were speaking of with chronology, Joe. Sorry, Zoe is my son. Joe, about how you order the literature review. I would order mine in terms of which author I found to be most effective, and I would base that on the relevance to my research question or even my paths of research that I wanted to take. So you can even add that in there if you're as pedantic as me.
Yeah, something like, I mean, what I'm imagining is something like a mind map model of the literature review, where you have the main author who you're seeing how they relate to all the others. So you could organize it that way as well. That's probably more useful if you're in maybe the humanities fields or the literature fields, where maybe you have a key author who's the center of your research. And so, yeah, one way to organize it would be showing how different people relate to that. Probably less useful if you're doing more, strictly science stuff, but maybe
not necessarily, because then you can do the research about the authors or the team of authors and what they have been looking at, recently in other studies that they've published and where they've published. So if you want to choose, it's always a battle, I think, with the sciences. I'm not an expert of the newest research versus the most credible research versus the I would call it the home base of research, who they are and where they're researching from, what they have access to, and so on. I don't know. But scientists, if you're here, correct me or us if we're wrong. Writing a literature review for the sciences has to be a quite daunting task as well.
Yeah, maybe anybody else want to either questions or problems you're having now, or I've appreciated Hannah and other people who have and I think it was Lenka who gave us some tips. What worked for you? Anybody else have some good resources or good tips? And you can also send us, links if you find good stuff. We'll add them to our page of resources for you, for everybody else.
I think you probably know this, but there's this app called Zotero, and it's for bibliographic references, and it's really good because you can keep your research ordered, and you don't really need to look for the articles in your computer, and it's really nice.
Those are super cool. I'm gonna include that one in my list. Thanks for letting me know.
And I'm sure you guys, the only thing with any of those apps is you need to double check the work that it does and make sure that, especially those, I'm not familiar with the one you're talking about, Valentina, but the ones that like fetch the citation for you, right, and put them in. I've seen so many mistakes with that in the final thing. So that's where you need to proofread and remember that you are smarter than the machine. So it may be very helpful. I'm not saying don't use them because they are very, very helpful, but you need to make sure that they're correct and double check those references.
Which makes it a bit easier when you do it one at a time, slowly, as you
Yeah,
annotate. It
exactly.
saves you from that real, I don't know what to compare it to. It's a special level of hell if you have to actually go through and do each of your references for your final paper individually, make sure that they're spotless. I don't envy you that process.
Yeah,
It's happened to me.
Yeah, make sure you do it as you go. I would also say that. Otherwise, you could be in big trouble.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have had students who like turn in a paper and tell me, and I'm like, where are the resources to this? And they're like, oh, I'll add those later. And I'm like, well, good luck. It usually ends badly. So do the citations as you go along. That would be another big.
And not only the citations, but if you remember the specific pages of where you found your quotations or where you found the most interesting passages, please write them down. Please write them down. Otherwise, you'll have to go through all those sources again to find the pages where you found the quote. And if those sources aren't digital, you'll have to look for them manually through your books. Which, by the way, I don't think we mentioned how to annotate, I don't know, hard copies of books, for example, like this. But if you're interested, we could do a more in-depth thing on annotations, or we can give you some sources. The easiest or the quickest thing I can say is break it into smaller parts.
I think we should do one. We should do a gab, Abbie, on maybe quotations and citations and how to do those like a little bit more technically. But again, that's another thing I wanted to say about those apps that just do the citations for you. Another problem with it is that you might end up with a text where it is simply that format that where it's the quotation or the summary and then the citation at the end. And you're missing an opportunity if your text is all done in that way. You're missing the opportunity that I showed you in my last, point where, to actually lead this, attribute the sources in the sentences themselves in a more sophisticated way. And if you can learn how to do that, you can make your work sound a lot more professional. You can solve a lot of sentence structure and repetition problems, yeah, solve a bunch of other problems as well. So I guess that's another danger with those apps is I would say use them to keep track, if it helps you keep track of your citations in the writing process, but then go back through and, like, for example, I often see like it's 3 sentences in a row and the person is summarizing different points from the same source and every sentence ends Holman blah, blah, et al. 19, and then the next sentence Holman et al. Blah, blah. Like, oh my God, some rewriting of that would make it sound so much better, and avoid that headache and the train wreck, as we said, for the reader. So don't forget that you should do that as well.
And if you are writing those maybe standalone literature reviews, you could use them as practice for precisely that. How to, for example, write it more effectively, where it isn't this kind of misformulated, amalgamation of everything everybody else has said without much of your own voice, or it's a little bit chaotic. You could, not necessarily get the assignment done to get it done, but really take it as a practice, because I think as we've tried to hammer into your minds here, it's a huge part of the thesis writing process, no matter what level you're at. Of course, it increases in complexity as you go on, but it's really an integral skill to being an academic, I would say, or publishing any kind of academic work, bachelor's thesis included, of course. So take it as practice, not busy work. What do you think, Joe? Does anybody else want to add any final comments?
Yeah, I was going to say maybe one person maybe.
Leave you for today? I think next week, if I can go ahead and shamelessly plug our next writing gap, I think next week we're going to actually focus on...
Okay, Abbie, not
no,
next week.
No, sorry. Thank you. We plan it right now for the 28th of May, but the next time, we're going to look at how to write proposals, research proposals, or a prospectus, as you might call it, or essentially how to outline your entire research project, not just outline the literature review. So this part, the literature review process, would definitely be a key part of that. So if you're interested, or if you found this helpful, please do join us next time for the continuation.
Yeah, and let us know if there's other genres or other assignments, or kinds of academic writing or even other kinds of writing that you want us to gab about, and we will make it happen. So we're happy to hear from you. Yeah, so thanks everybody, and we'll see you next time, hopefully. And please, like I said, remember that we are here. You can make an appointment anytime at the Writing Center, and you can watch our other gabs on the YouTube, and you can follow us on the Facebook, and that will make us happy. So see you soon. Thanks.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.